So we're talking today about a well-known book that was written at the end of the war, no doubt influenced by the events of the Second World War. We're talking about George Orwell, 1984, originally published on the 8th of June, 1949. It tells of a society where governments, those in charge, rule. And basically this government would stamp down in the book on anybody who opposed them. They would have been brainwashed. It would have been quite brutal, and people have had their minds and their thinking quite literally changed. So it tells of an authority of a government that all the citizens should quite rightly fear. They were telling all kinds of stories, constantly at war with one person, then at war with another countries. So we're going to look and see if we've got close to that society and why governments would want that kind of society. Now, the first thing that he did predict in the novel, there are cameras all over the place. Now, if you'd have read this book in 1984, there would have been hardly any CCTV cameras around. The interesting thing is, since 1984, and especially in the 90s and the noughties, there are CCTV cameras everywhere, and Europe is got lots of them, but Britain's got even more. So that's already one thing which he foresaw. It means that we can be tracked and watched everywhere we go. So Anthony, first of all, what do you think that we've got close to this world that when he wrote the book, I mean, none of this really was going on?
Jeff, I think we've almost surpassed it in some ways. I mean, one of the main things in his book was this idea of the complete lack of free thought, and how that is coming about, or lack of ability to express free thought in modern Western society, is the idea of political correctness, which is the notion that there are certain words and phrases you can say and certain words and phrases that you can't say that are beyond the pale. And we've seen various footballers, football managers and celebrities whose careers have been ruined by coming out and saying controversial things. And we've seen over time there's less and less you can actually express. There's less ways you can express yourself. Now, if we want to live in a free society, we should be able to say whatever we want, as long as it's not obviously rude or offensive. So I would say that in modern society, it is very much like 1984 in that the kind of framework for thought, or the outlet to express ourselves, certainly in the public realm, is becoming smaller and smaller. The idea of what's acceptable to say, And
I guess if you're a government, then it's easier to control your citizens if you can cut down on the kind of things they can do and the kind of things that they can actually say.
Definitely. So it's all about power and control, like you were saying. Now, one of the things I found weird, which isn't necessarily in Big Brother 1984, but it really does help kind of like focus all of society into thinking in certain ways, and that's to do with the smartphones we have. So obviously it wasn't predicted, the idea of the technology just wasn't about back then. But what we have now in our pockets is the biggest mind-controlling system ever. I mean, just look at like Instagram, you've got WhatsApp, you've got all these messaging services now where we're always putting around the same ideas and repeating them. Like Facebook, it's just the same thing over and over and over again, and it's almost like setting the way in which we think.
But is it, some would say that it aids communication, and as human beings, most of us are quite sociable, so it allows you to talk to people. I mean, some of it might be quite inane, but then some conversation is, but it's just nice for people to be in contact, like, how are you? Whereas before, if you even go back to the 80s, I mean, the closest you could get to somebody that you weren't in the same room with would have been a landline. So you couldn't walk down the street and communicate. Some might say, well, actually, that's quite good, and there have been some revolutions which have been filmed on smartphones. Also authorities and people who represent authorities getting up to stuff they shouldn't be doing has actually been filmed without the smartphone. That couldn't have happened, and the whole world can look at it. And don't we get more freedom with something like YouTube? Well, we can see the authorities and people who represent those authorities behaving in a way which could be illegal.
Well, you are right there. There is the good side of the technology, but I mean, I'm taking the idea, say, like from the TV. So in 1984, Big Brother, the TV kind of like told you what to think.
Yeah.
In a way, our TVs do the same thing. I mean, just take Friends. How many people do you think watched that? Now, how many people watching that started acting like they did because the TV told them they could? It sets a standard for how to act. And this is just one example of how it's happened throughout the decades. And now we have a device in our pocket to give instantly, minute by minute, an update of how to act, how to look. Because don't you walk down the street now and see a million copies of the same face?
I would kind of say that I guess the other side to that is that this technology can kind of open up things to us, but you're right, it can be limiting. But that thing about maybe copying, but is that something that people would grow out of? So in other words, might it be people of a certain age might, for instance, they'd follow a rock star or something. I guess we've all done it, so okay, the rock star's got that particular jumper on, jacket, I'm going to copy them. But then don't we get to a stage where we kind of grow out? Is that process though not part of just normal growing up?
It is to an extent, but the way in which we are manipulated on a daily basis, we no longer have control of it like we used to. Because we might stop following that particular person, but then we might start following another person and start following them and acting like they do and start wearing the same sort of clothes. And then we'll go on to the next person and to the next person, because they're all there at a touch of a button. We can instantly find out what they're wearing, what they're up to, what they're like.
Okay, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, there is a kind of a certain amount of slavery in that. There is a certain amount of, well, can't you think for yourself? Anthony, what do you think?
Well, in terms of modern technology, let's say the internet, in terms of the internet, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because the internet has allowed the spreading of new ideas that maybe the government and the authorities, are not keen to get out there in the public consciousness. But by the same token, it's almost like the corporate world then co-opts those ideas and kind of, shapes them to their own ends. And the other thing, I think there is a danger, and I know obviously we're talking about conspiracies, and for conspiracy researchers, all those who are on the path of awakening and, truth seekers, all these words that get bandied around, that you just become reliant on the internet. I think it's important to say that we still need to meet up with like-minded people to try and express novel and new ideas. There is this danger of we feel like we're connecting to people through Facebook and Twitter and all these things, when really a part of me thinks that the authorities quite like that, because we're not actually really gathering together. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think we should not be doing that, but I think it's the idea of balance about meeting face to face as well, because obviously otherwise we're going to lose our humanness. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that children growing up now, their social skills and their psychology is being affected by this use of this technology.
And that's a good point, because if you, for instance, there are reports where people are bullying online, and of course, because the child is not connected to the person they're bullying, it's even less association with it. So they're not associating with their behaviour. They're not realising, they can't see somebody in front of them they're causing pain to. So, I mean, it is a good point that maybe we should be communicating more. The thing is, though, the people who are doing this, Facebook is not government, it's business is driving this kind of change.
And that's even scarier. I mean, the fact is, Facebook is one of the worst offenders when it actually comes to affecting how people think. I mean, it's even been caught out of running its own psychological experiments of choosing what content certain people see. And they actually, it was to do with happy or sad messages. And they found out if they showed people more sad stuff, then that person would respond sad. But if they showed people more happy stuff, that person would respond happy. I mean, they're doing psychological tests on us without telling us. I mean, what's worse than that? I
mean, that is a scary thing. And of course, a corporation is there for everything they do is just about money and gain. So that's the only reason that they're doing those things. There's no other motive. It's not to improve humanity.
No, definitely not.
So what about so going back to the book, and of course it's great if you are a government, if you can control people. So you've got CCTV cameras all over the place, which were predicted in 1984. It means that you can know what they're doing. I mean, some people might say that's a good thing, because if people feel they're being watched, they're less likely to commit crimes. If there are cameras out in the street, they're less likely, you would hope, to they wouldn't be assaulting people, they wouldn't be doing that kind of thing. So maybe in some ways is this technology not a good thing?
I mean, with cameras, they do say that they distract from crime, because they're actually, recordings I don't want to be recorded. But, I mean, according to the law courts, all cameras do is help with a conviction. They don't do anything to stop crime. The crime still happens, it's got it on video.
And I suppose you'll see those things, and I suppose if you see those drunken brawls on a Friday or Saturday night, and people's consciousness is gone anyway, so they're not really going to be thinking there's a camera up there. I mean, afterwards, when they sober up, they might think, well, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. But yeah, as you say, it helps to convict people. What about in the book, where basically the government are manipulating things? So 1 minute they'll tell the people, because they want to instill a sense of fear in them, that those people from that country, we've always been at war with those people, and you cannot trust those people. And then, of course, several months later, to suit themselves, that government would say, no, we've never been at war at them, but we're now at war with this country. And so there was a sense of fear, and this is a human thing, isn't it? I guess it goes back to tribal days. You would fear people who were from another tribe because you didn't know them. Is this not the same thing on a grand scale? And is it good to do that, or does it make us constantly fearful of people who look different to us? Maybe their skin colour is different, maybe their customs are different. Is this a bad thing for us as human beings?
I would say the manipulation of enemies, or the creation of enemies and then shifting them around, we can see at the moment with Russia. At the moment, Russia is being cast as the bad guy. We got the potential banning of their athletes at the Olympic Games. We got NATO, more and more their troops are being positioned on Russia's border, and yet in the wake of the collapse of communism, Russia, in the Western world, was seen as our friend. We wanted to bring them in. And now in the last few years, they're all being decried as our enemy. So it's interesting how, like in the book, it just shifts. 1 minute Russia's our enemy during the communist era, then the communism collapse, Russia is our friend. Now they're our enemy again, Putin, the great dictator, and all this sort of stuff. So I think that what he was speaking about in the book is, it happens in modern society. It's happened,
Not only that, it gets even worse, because you keep talking about that terror, that fear going on. Well, it's happening today, isn't it? We're calling it terrorism. Enemies are being created, events are made to happen to get us into a state of fear, to get us to agree whatever's coming next.
But if people are doing stuff which I mean, we can see it. There are people who are harming society. I mean, we won't go into any individual cases. We don't need to do that here. But, we're hearing it in the news all the time, shopping malls being blown up. I mean, that really is going on. I mean, that's not what any society wants, surely, to be able to, you want to be able to go shopping or whatever it is you want to do without the fear that you're going to get blown up, or somebody that you are, one of your friends or somebody that you care about is going to be blown up either.
Definitely, and that's not a good environment for anyone to be in, because the body can only deal with so much stress before it actually starts reacting to it physically, not just mentally.
And whoever is behind these terrorist attacks, and whether they're orchestrated or not, is almost irrelevant to the point that the government will manipulate the outcome to their own ends. So what we'll see is more anti-terror legislation, and we're seeing that more and more over the time. In France, they still have emergency measures in place since the Paris attacks last November. They're still in place now.
So these could be used then, so a government could then use those, you could use that then. Let's say, for instance, they've put an emergency measure where they can stop and search anybody. The normal precautions of law don't apply, so these people aren't acting in a suspicious manner. They can just pull them over without having any grounds. So then I guess it's in the government's interest to keep that there, so in other words, anybody can be questioned, and they don't need to give a reason why it's been done.
Well, you had that obviously in Northern Ireland in the 60s, 70s and 80s, the stop and search, which was a very divisive policy. It created a lot of animosity between the police security forces and the residents in these areas. So yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I suppose from the authorities' point of view, if any, especially with terrorism, you know, when you see a soldier, he's got his uniform on, you know which side he's on. And normally, traditionally, you know, one side are on one country, another one are in another. You know, they're in a trench, they're looking at each other. It's clearly defined. You know who they are. I guess the thing is with terrorism, they could be anybody walking down the street. And I guess from a security services point of view, you'd want to check everybody because anybody walking towards you, no matter how sweet and innocent they look, could possibly be carrying some kind of device. It's a very difficult one, isn't it, really, I suppose?
Very difficult indeed. And that's where they want us to be, because as soon as you start thinking everybody is your enemy, how can you come together and join communities? I mean, it's almost dog-eat-dog world to the extreme.
So do we need, I mean, here's another point then, looking at something that we might need, because this is obviously creating fear. And you mentioned a good word there, you don't hear it very often, sense of community. And you'll often hear older generations saying, and I don't know if this was true, sometimes you can look back and think, well, life was better then. But many people will say, for instance, the war, there was a sense of community. People wanted it because they had to. They really had no choice. So you mentioned community. Should we maybe thinking about our communities? Should we maybe thinking about people around us rather than getting feared up about situations which, in many cases, fortunately, most of us won't encounter these dreadful situations?
Well, like you say, it should all be about the community. I mean, because in the old days, you couldn't rely on, say, your government to help you out. You had to rely on your local community. You know, your friends, family, or someone you knew like that. But these days, that almost doesn't happen. There is no sense of community anymore. I mean, it's almost been taken apart bit by bit by the corporations.
Well, and that's interesting. It goes back to a point that we mentioned earlier on, the fact that Facebook is a great way to communicate, but also it means that people don't speak to each other. There's no interaction. There's no body language. They're not getting used to reading the person in front of them. So does that isolate people, and that makes it even more difficult to have a community?
Yeah,
I'd definitely say one of the negative effects of the internet and the development of social media is it's creating virtual communities, but we still need real organic communities. And as Mike said, as corporations have got more and more powerful, it's like the corporations are the intermediaries. I mean, they provide our food, they build the houses, they do everything, whereas once upon a time we had to do that for ourselves in local communities. So
and then everybody helped each other, didn't they? And of course then there was a sense that somebody was in trouble or having problems, so people would rally around and we need to help this person.
Exactly. Yeah. And where that's been eroded away, now you find homelessness is going through the roof. Prison numbers are going through the roof. Everything's falling apart because companies wanted to make more money.
And you can hear on a simple level, it's interesting, this thing about creating a climate of fear. And I think there was one newsreader, I don't know if it was Martin Lewis, and it sounds a bit funny, but actually it's not a bad idea. I remember he went to the, I forget whether he's working for BBC or ITV, and said, well, we should have some good news. And they kind of laughed at him and said, well, nobody will want that kind of thing. They only want to hear about doom and gloom. But I wonder, really, if you had that sense of community and people talking about, well, this project has just started, they're going to help so many people, this project is going on in your community, you could get involved in that. Wouldn't that create a more positive thing and get rid of this climate of fear?
Exactly. But this is another thing, just that very word of people don't want that. That's another thing that sets everything within society, because as soon as the editor-in-chief goes, well, actually, we don't want that story because that's not going to be profitable for us, suddenly you're editing the news, you're censoring news based on what you think people want.
And that's interesting, is that you have that power, and basically, again, it's a subject we've often talked about. It's focused on money, it's money-led. It's not that it necessarily be good for people, and I guess after a while they get to know, well, actually, people react to this story, it's a big tragedy, so for maybe 7 days, nothing has happened. And then suddenly there's something which is heart-rending, which does cause pain, and suddenly it's like, well, there's a need to tell that story, but then on the other hand, that spikes up newspaper sales.
Most commercial news broadcasters are obviously curtailed by advertising interests, so their stories will reflect that, and there'll be, if there's sensitive issues, they're not going to be broadcast, because then advertisers won't pay to broadcast their adverts during the slots. And the other thing about the news, of course, is most news doesn't tend to be of a local nature, and it has no direct effect on the viewers. And yet I know in Britain, once upon a time, I was very much addicted to the news, because there's a sense in which if you're up to date with the news, you're intellectual or you're clever. There's this idea that you know what's going on.
Yeah.
And of course that's a falsehood, because a lot of it doesn't affect you, it doesn't empower you, it actually disempowers you. And like you said, Jeff, what we really need is positive news of a local basis that bring people together, because the mainstream news as we have it actually divides people, creates fear and hatred between.
And that's a really good point. And if you look, and I often look at things that go on in communities, there are great stories of people who, for one reason or another, are driven to change things. And when you hear their stories, I mean, it's just incredible. You think, well, one person started this thing off, then they were able to help other people. I think that's just incredible.
Yeah, I do think that needs to be publicised more as well, because then if people can get a sense of empowerment within their local community that small things actually do bring about change, then more people would do it. And now you can see how, from the government and the powers that be perspective, that's why the news is constructed the way it is, because it disempowers people. Whereas if it was locally sourced about stories that affect people and they felt empowered, then society would begin to change. And as we know, it's all about keeping society as it is.
So some interesting points there. You can join in the conversation. Email studio@uktalkradio.org. We started by talking about George Orwell, the story of governments, regimes trying to control their citizens, a lot of the time by fear. So do you think that we generally live in that kind of way? Do you think, well, never in this country, it's not like that? Or have you got examples where that may have happened? We were also talking there, some interesting points at the end. Do you think your local community is very much ignored, where you have some fantastic stories of people doing great work? And would you like to get involved more in your community? Do you think that it would help us to become a lot more tolerant, a lot more understanding, and less fearful? Email studio@uktalkradio.org. Love to know what you think. So we're talking today about a well-known book that was written at the end of the war, no doubt influenced by the events of the Second World War. We're talking about George Orwell, 1984, originally published on the 8th of June, 1949. It tells of a society where governments, those in charge, rule. And basically this government would stamp down in the book on anybody who opposed them. They would have been brainwashed, they would have been quite brutal, and people have had their minds and their thinking quite literally changed. So it tells of an authority of a government that all the citizens should quite rightly fear. They were telling all kinds of stories, constantly at war with one person, then at war with another countries. So we're going to look and see if...
But what we have now in our pockets is the biggest mind-controlling system ever. I mean, just look at Instagram, you've got WhatsApp, you've got all these messaging services now where we're always putting around the same ideas and repeating them. Like Facebook, it's just the same thing over and over and over again. And it's almost like setting the way in which we think.
But is it, some would say that it aids communication, and as human beings, most of us are quite sociable, so it allows you to talk to people. I mean, some of it might be quite inane, but then some conversation is, but it's just nice for people to be in contact, like, how are you? Whereas before, if you even go back to the 80s, I mean, the closest you could get to somebody that you weren't in the same room with would have been
or in the kind of framework for thought, or the outlet to express ourselves, certainly in the public realm, is becoming smaller and smaller. The idea of what's acceptable to say, you know.
And I guess if you're a government, then it's easier to control your citizens if you can cut down on the kind of things they can do and the kind of things that they can actually say.
Definitely. So it's all about power and control, like you were saying. Now, one of the things I found weird, which isn't necessarily in Big Brother 1984, but it really does help kind of like focus all of society into thinking in certain ways, and that's to do with the smartphones we have. So obviously it wasn't predicted, the idea of the technology just wasn't about back then.
Was this idea of the complete lack of free thought, and how that is coming about, or lack of ability to express free thought in modern Western society, is the idea of political correctness, which is the notion that there are certain words and phrases you can say and certain words and phrases that you can't say that are beyond the pale. And we've seen various footballers, football managers and celebrities whose careers have been ruined by coming out and saying controversial things. And we've seen over time there's less and less you can actually express. There's less ways you can express yourself. Now, if we want to live in a free society, we should be able to say whatever we want, as long as it's not obviously rude or offensive. So I would say that in modern society, it is very much like 1984.
We've got close to that society, and why governments would want that kind of society. Now, the first thing that he did predict in the novel, there are cameras all over the place. Now, if you'd have read this book in 1984, there would have been hardly any CCTV cameras around. The interesting thing is, since 1984, and especially in the 90s and the noughties, there are CCTV cameras everywhere, and Europe is got lots of them, but Britain's got even more. So that's already one thing which he foresaw. It means that we can be tracked and watched everywhere we go. Anthony, first of all, what do you think that we've got close to this world that when he wrote the book, I mean, none of this really was going on?
Jeff, I think we've almost surpassed it in some ways. I mean, one of the main things in his book